And we are your hosts for today's broadcast, following top news stories of the day.
Good, great, grand, wonderful.
I have a bad feeling about this.
What ain't no country I ever heard of? They speak English and what?
It's the good,
the bad,
and the what?
Lost your train of thought, didn't I?
Hello, North Bend Film Festival. Welcome to a very special episode of The Good, the Bad, and the What, the show in which we dissect what makes a movie good, bad, or other within a certain theme, category, subgenre, or filmography. I'm Ryan Oliver.
And I'm Chris Thomas.
Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited. We're very grateful, very honored for the North Bend Film Festival to be having us. If you are new to this show, welcome. Just a little bit of elaboration on our shtick before we get started proper. As I mentioned at the top, we pick a certain theme, we pick a category, we pick a filmography, whatever the case may be, and we talk about what makes a movie good in it, what makes a movie bad in it, and what makes a movie other or what within it. So because we are here at the North Bend Film Festival, the premier Vanguard Film Festival of the Pacific Northwest, today we're going to be looking at Vanguard sci-fi horror dramas from the late 90s and the early 2000s that have some sort of element of either time travel, time bending, whatever you want to call it. They have elements of that. And on a traditional episode, on our normal episode, Chris and I swap taking picks. We trade off picking movies each week, but for this special occasion, we put our heads together and came up with these ourselves. So I will introduce the picks and we will just get into it. For the good, in honor of its 20th anniversary here at the North Bend Film Festival, we will be talking about Donnie Darko from 2001, directed by Richard Kelley. For the bad, we will be talking about The Butterfly Effect from 2004, directed by Eric Bress and J. Mackie Gruber. And for the what, we will be talking about Lost Highway from 1997, directed by David Lynch, arguably one of his more polarizing efforts. So looking forward to diving into that. But we're going to start, as always, we usually start with the good, and then we move to the bad, and then we move to the what. And so we're going to start with Donnie Darko. And Chris, I want to kick it over to you because we've had different relationships with this movie since 2001. So I want to hear more about yours because I know this was a very special movie to you at least one point in time, and looking forward to seeing if that is still the case.
It's sort of the case, but for very different reasons. I mean, when I first saw Donnie Darko, I saw it like 2004, 2005. So I'm like just entering high school. So of course, I guess you could have described me as a bit of an edgelord and brooding. So then I saw a bit of myself reflected in Donnie being sort of a darker counterculture, fighting, authority figures sort of attitude that he had, and sort of like his edgy know-it-allness of always having the right thing to say, sort of the arguments that you would have with yourself in the shower where you always come out on top, but of course those don't happen in reality. So then I sort of, liked that about the character. And then, the overall aesthetic, it's really fun. The sci-fi elements are really well done and great. And I'm specifically talking about the theatrical version. That's the one that I was introduced to and the one that I fell in love with. And the director's cut spells those elements out a bit more, and I think we'll get into a bit of a comparison between the two. But the theatrical version, by keeping those things ambiguous, there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of mystery. So there was a lot of elements and stuff that I sort of fell in love with when I was in that headspace in my adolescence, that now going back and revisiting it, which I hadn't really revisited it since high school, there's a lot more that I've sort of picked up on and respected and really liked about the movie. Not so much, there was definitely some things that I thought were really cool when I was 14 that now I'm a little bit like I don't really relate to that anymore. So it doesn't really work for me in the same way, but I think it stands on its own legs just in a very different moment in my life. And so I think it's still largely successful.
Absolutely. And I think that's something I want to piggyback off of, because I felt similarly in terms of picking up on things that I definitely didn't when I was younger. My relationship's a bit different with the movie. I didn't watch it, I think probably till like 2008 or 9, I want to say. So like right as I was about exiting high school, getting into college, and was like really starting to like get into film, and I guess maybe that was a couple years prior, but either way, like I was starting to get into movies. And so I think when I watched Donnie Darko, just given that it, of course it's like a cult, a definitive cult movie, like it absolutely is that. And so I think when I first saw it, I just didn't really have the sort of um I don't know, like the relatability to those things that you were talking about. Like I just didn't quite relate to those, and nor did I have the sort of like knowledge to pick up on everything else going in the background. So it's a movie that I was like, okay, like I liked it because I like a lot of the performances that are great. I like the vibe of the movie, which we'll dive into more. But I just, it never really connected with me the way that it did with you when you were younger, and it did with a lot of people, of course. And so watching it as an adult, it's like I almost feel a little stupid that I didn't pick up on these things because they're so overtly there. And what I ultimately latched onto this time out, I think this is going to be the meat of our discussion, is how this movie is like the antithesis of 80s nostalgia. Like even on the back of the box, I actually have it here. This fantastic 4K that Arrow Video put out recently. It is a beautiful transfer, the best I think this movie has ever looked. But on the back of the box, it even said like 15 years before Stranger Things incorporated like 80s nostalgia and Spielbergian touches and something like that. And as I was watching this again, I was like, but this is kind of like the anti version of that, because I think this movie largely is what Richard Kelley is saying is like the 80s actually kind of suck. And the sort of like hooks that were dug in by Reaganomics is like, largely looming in this movie and largely looming to this day. And of course, prescient that this came out during George W. Bush's first term in office. We see the scene later, like early in the movie, when Donnie's father is watching a presidential debate between Dukakis and George Herbert Walker Bush, and he's like bitching about Dukakis.
Never again do business with a drug-running Panamanian dictator, that we never again funnel aid to the Contras who convicted drug dealers. Son of a bitch.
So it's like those sort of like, the face of like contemporary conservatism is like dug its claws so deep, even to like Donnie's parents, which are like, in this like idyllic Leave It to Beaver type town. His parents are very like hip to kind of the bullshit that's going on in their community, but even then they have these views that like I like are completely diametrically opposed to Donnie's. So that's the stuff I really picked up at this time out, and I was like, oh, this is actually really like, I feel like an astute criticism of that, and using the sort of 80s nostalgia as like a juxtaposition. It's not like saying, hey, do you remember Echo and the Bunnymen and Tears for Fears? Admittedly, some fantastic needle drops. But it's not saying, do you remember these? It's like using it as like a shield of saying like, okay, yeah, you remember this time, but here's all the stuff that kind of sucked about this era that you probably weren't thinking about.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of the problems that, not the supernatural elements, we'll get into those a bit itself, but a lot of the problems that Donnie is experiencing, like I said, when I was younger, are relatable and are sort of timeless, of like, not getting along with classmates because you're the weird kid, or not getting along with your family and butting heads with authority figures. Counterculturalism has always been around to some extent. But you're right that it doesn't make sense to me, at least when you read that back of that box, to make a direct comparison of Donnie Darko to Stranger Things. Are two very, very vastly different buckets. They both happened in the 80s, but of course, like, Stranger Things is very much just dripping with nostalgia, and Donnie Darko is not. It's just a movie that happens to be set in that time, and yeah, it has needle drops, and a lot of the songs are great, but like you're saying, a lot of the stuff that it's comparatively pulling from the era is stuff like the specter of Ronald Reagan and Reaganomics, and what it did to culture, sort of this Big Brother-esque sort of authority figures thinking that they know what's best for the kids of the time, and so then they will enact laws and they will make decisions. As we're getting into the era of parental advisory on CDs and albums that say the word fuck, well, we can't have our kids knowing that bad words exist, we're going to make those decisions for them. And we're seeing that sort of leaking into the lessons that teachers are teaching in school. And that was very much an 80s thing of adolescents basically being under attack by a generation of people that thought that they knew better. And so then we get to make those decisions. And so it's really refreshing, because of course at the time that this movie came out, there really wasn't this big 80s everything that's all the time is just like, I mean, it's in video games and stuff now.
Yeah.
Just, oh, you remember like flashy colors and oh, Rambo is in things now. And that wasn't the case when this movie came out. And so it's kind of refreshing to go back before that deluge into pop culture started happening and being like, look at somebody taking a realistic, real overview look at this era and criticizing it. It was really nice to watch that.
Agree, going back, because like as early as I can think of, maybe it happened earlier, the sort of like maybe pinpoint of the ushering in of this 80s nostalgia might be something like The Wedding Singer, which came out 3 years before this. So only 3 years separates something like that versus this. So like early on, Richard Kelley was already taking a critical lens to what was already starting to bubble, which was this like, you know, this sort of reverence for a period that, again, like, you know, sure, the things in popular culture people remember and love, but people tend to forget of all the other shady shit that's happening in the background, as evident by, like you said, the authority figures who think they know what's best, which is like, I love that this movie so like just takes them down a peg or two. I mean, so, you know, specifically in like the what is it, the PTA meeting when they're talking about the banning books, and even Donnie's parents are like, what exactly are you getting at? Like, can we move on? This isn't on the agenda. Let's actually do the thing. Or, you know, in the case of course, Patrick Swayze's character, the Jim Cunningham, the like, you know, BS like self-help guru who's got more than a few horrible secrets. And so it's like that whole like dynamic of just like hiding underneath this guy is of like, because it kind of opened the door of like this era really opened the door to those people, made those people feel empowered. And again, I think we're still feeling that today of like authority figures who think that they're better, or they're acting in a way because in it some sort of self-righteousness, especially like that mother character I'm referring to, because it's like, it's a lot of like religious aspects. And like we see that in like contemporary Christianity of people like acting like because it's above you, so they're like acting like it's and it's just like it's a load of crap. And so like I again, it was refreshing to see this, as you said, refreshing is the word, to see this like really pointed out.
Well, and she's very much like a Stephen King-esque character of coming in and I'm the ultimate authority figure. I will call the shots here and shout down anybody who questions me. But the parent-teacher meeting being one example of it, but like in Swayze's character, just this ultimate hypocrisy of these people who are ultimately flawed, acting as if they are just the messengers of what is good and what is righteous, and calling it out blatantly, especially in that scene at the PTA meeting where they Donnie's mom is like, do you even know who Graham Greene is? And I think we've all seen Bananas, which is just calling out that like, how can you speak with authority on a subject that you yourself are admittedly ignorant of? And it's nice to sort of call that out. It's an issue that persists. There's still people who will go out and lord and say like, you know, people can't make these decisions with their life and whatnot. I feel like it was really in the 80s when media started to explode, which is why we see so much of it now in pop culture, is that there was an abundance of content that came out of the 80s that, you know, commercials, TV shows, and everything like that, that sort of informed the era. So there's ample things to pull from in modern media. And I think that's sort of era started to bring these people out of the woodwork because they were now handed a megaphone. Whereas once it used to be, you know, they policed their communities, but now they're on television. They can police their state, they can police the world, or at least attempt to. And self-help gurus blew up in the 80s as well. And a lot calling out the hypocrisy when they're at the meeting where Cunningham goes to their school and has his own chat with the kids and is telling them all emotion is just boiled down to either love or it's fear, and give me these scenarios and I'll just give you some bullshit answer, which I love that in the fact in that scene montage it. They don't let him do his spiel because ultimately it doesn't matter. It's all the posturing anyway. Exemplified by the fact that one of the kids that's in that scene appears in the self-help Cunningham video.
Yes.
So he's like an audience plant that's there to ask the pre-canned video that he has an answer for, and then just Donnie going up there and just being like,
how much are they paying you to be here?
Excuse me? I believe you were searching for the answers in all the wrong places.
You're right, actually. I am I'm pretty troubled and I'm pretty confused, but I'm afraid, really afraid. Really afraid, but I think you're fucking Antichrist.
And just coming back with sensible answers of just like, you don't have to get your answers from a book, just fucking live your life, and then you will naturally come to the same conclusions that people have for eons and generations. Like, it's not up to this guy to tell you how to make decisions and live your life, which I think is the sort of stuff that sort of resonated with me a bit more as I understand it a bit more. It's not just surface level, like, yeah, get him, Donnie. It's just like, yeah, it's a cultural problem. I'm glad you're calling it.
Yeah, I feel the same way, because I felt, you know, mentioning when I was younger, like I never really connected to that sort of like the lashing out aspect. But like now seeing it as an adult, it's like, oh, this isn't like lashing out. I mean, it sort of is, you know, it's like, because he's got like the, you know, teenage angst going on with it, but it's lashing out for a purpose and lashing out with an actual like critical point of view. And, you know, I mean, he's essentially Richard Kelley in this situation. Like, he's the vessel to get the ideas across in the movie. Sure. And I mean, he does it in a way that like isn't like didactic or talking down. Like, it actually like fits the sort of situation. And like you said, this was the era of, you already pointed it out, the parental advisory sticker. This was the Tipper Gore like era, like crackdown, and like, of course, MPAA getting like super strict about things. You know, not to get tangential for our new listeners, but I know you and I are big like Friday the 13th fans, and how like those later movies got like edited to shreds because they're too violent and we can't have these out. And there's that, I mean, I have to point out, I mean, I think maybe one of the standout sequences, there are many in this movie, is to show that juxtaposition that I love is the Tears for Fears montage, getting off the bus, and like the tracking shot that goes through of like, okay, here's like your school where everyone's required to wear uniforms. Like, it's that type of like sort of disciplinary, like, you're going to live by this rule. But then it's like the kids are snorting coke out of their locker and like doing all these other things. And it's like, I love that sort of like, no, like, they're going to do what they're going to do. And actually, you're probably pushing that further the other direction by blatantly, you know, like exploiting your own authority.
Right. Yeah. Everybody has to fit into this box, but like, that's not how the world works. But then I also love like that this is sort of like the overarching theme that's going on in the movie that they're exploring, but instead of it just being that surface level of Donnie's a kid in this this world, and these are the things that he, you know, runs into and has to deal with in terms of conflicts, but introducing it in the way of this like supernatural sci-fi element, which I like, we can't talk about Donnie Darko, not get into sort of those elements that make it work. And of course, mentioning, you already showed the case of the movie, mentioning Frank, who's a very important character in sort of the entire overall story. So we're already into spoilers, so sorry, but you know, we're going to get into even more. But just the idea of the movie itself, Donnie is a troubled kid. He's not getting along with anybody. He's sleepwalking. He has to take medication. He's recently stopped taking medication, according to an argument that he has with his sister over dinner.
Do you want to tell Mom and Dad why you stopped taking your medication?
You're such a fuck ass.
What? Please.
Did you just call me a fuck ass?
Elizabeth, that's enough.
You can go suck a fuck.
Oh, please tell me, Elizabeth, how exactly does one suck a fuck?
So we know that he's sort of struggling with his own identity, which is not a strange thing for a kid to have to go through. But what is strange for a kid is that one night he wakes up to a voice who beckons him to leave his bedroom. He goes to a green on a golf course nearby where there is a man in a terrifying looking bunny suit who tells him that the world is going to end in 28 days and doesn't explain any further than that. Coincidentally, or not coincidentally, he avoids being crushed by I guess just an errant plane engine that falls through the roof of the house and destroys his bedroom. After that, things get really weird herky-jerky of interactions with Frank and trying to understand what's real, and it's very dreamlike. But I love that there's no real point where they sit down and they go, okay, here's the rules. Here's where Frank shows up or why Frank is showing up. What is Frank? They don't sit and spoon feed you those things. They introduce the elements and let them sort of, as organically as they can, for it being a man in a bunny suit, come up at beats in the story that drive it forward and cause Donnie to make decisions or take actions that are out of the ordinary, but ultimately end up revealing something dark or twisted or something that's in the underbelly of this tight-knit Leave It to Beaver community that he's in.
Yeah, and all of that stuff is very like like you said, it's all purposeful. Like it's one of those things where it is a bit like throughout it's like a bit ambiguous, it's a bit dream logic, it's a bit like that. And what I also like really appreciated this time out, to piggyback off what you said there as well, is like how it ties in, like how it ties into the whole like Leave It to Beaver aspect of the movie and how it like informs his decisions throughout the movie. It isn't just, the first time I saw this, I think I was led to believe that he was being manipulated by Frank in a lot of these situations, and in ways he is, but like watching it this time out, like realizing that it's like, oh no, he's the society is informing his decisions. Like he's informing his decisions based on what he knows. He has complete autonomy over this, and especially as we see by the end of the movie, which you succinctly put it, again, if you are new to this show, welcome, but because we talk about older movies, we do get into spoilers up front, so just be forewarned. But by the end, he has to make like an ultimate choice, and it isn't like by force. Like he's not forced to make it. Like nobody's forcing him to do it, and he doesn't even really quite understand the nature of what that is going to lead to. He just knows that it will do at least this one thing, and so he has to make that choice.
Well, and the ambiguity of it, where is because there's a time travel element that's in here, and it's not overt. If you were to ask like about a category of time travel movies, I don't think Donnie Darko would be one that I would put up there in that list. Like it's not a Back to the Future, it's not Primer, it's not something where the time travel is absolutely like integral to the story and to the plot. Like it's very important. But a lot of it is like implied and it's sort of happening in the background, and it becomes plot beats and plot points, but it's not the driving force. The driving force is Donnie pushing back against this world that doesn't understand him and is trying to put him in a box. And so the stuff that happens with Frank, where Frank shows up and of course like leads him out of his room, he avoids getting crushed by the jet engine, tells him to go put an axe through the water main of the school and floods it, which leads him to meeting Gretchen out in the wild. I mean, they'd met like in class or whatever, but like running into her and they have a bonding moment, and they end up, I think at that point he like asks her out. Yeah. And him leading him to the gun and his parents' closet. And so there's like stuff that happens throughout the movie where Frank will come in and push him more or less like to places where he needs to be to make a discovery, which will just inform what he ends up doing later. Or he pushes him to go burn down Swayze's house, which reveals a kiddie porn dungeon, the movie's words, not mine, which exposes, again, this underbelly, this seedy thing that was there under the community's noses, which they end up like pushing back against, which is like, again, just a further step of this hypocrisy of the community that pushing against immorality and what they deem to be immoral. And then when something that is absolutely heinous gets exposed, they rush to defend it because it reflects poorly upon themselves, which is, I mean, I love that. And it's just this ultimate hypocrisy that the movie just kind of looms over everything.
It's obviously some kind of conspiracy to destroy an innocent man. And I have taken it upon myself to spearhead the Jim Cunningham defense campaign.
But then Donnie talking to his professor, his physics professor played by Noah Wiley, and ultimately like getting the book that was written by Roberta Sparrow, who was introduced earlier as a crazed woman walking back and forth from her mailbox looking for mail, but she wrote a book about time travel. But then speaking strictly about the theatrical version, they don't really go into the book very much. It sort of just plants a seed there of saying there is a time travel element. There's something going on in terms of destiny and in terms of, you know, the actions that I take now are going to have huge ramifications later on. We're going to get into that when we talk about the second movie. But it doesn't make it like a central plot beat or a story right away, at least. And so I love that it plays with these sci-fi elements, but only to give Donnie and the cast of characters more to work with and more to consider when they're going through the actual core of it, of like what it means to be a person, what it means to be a person that acts in the community, what it means to have friendships and relationships, and what does love mean versus hate and fear, which is something that Swayze's character probably could have chewed on a bit more when he wasn't making child porn. I love that they use the sci-fi elements for a more core story that makes the characters and the world more interesting than just really dwelling in those elements.
Me too. I think I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's something I wanted to touch on as well, of how the element is like integrated into the story, and it's not just it's not just for like a Reddit board to figure out and like draw like different like flow charts and figure out. It's like, no, it's not. It's not complicated because the emotional center is there. So it's like, it doesn't like this, the time travel element, sure, it's maybe a little complicated, but not really. Like I feel like it's pretty like followable, everything that's happening, especially when you kind of get to the realization of like Frank is an actual person and not a like figment of Donnie's imagination, or like Donnie's not hallucinating these things, I guess is what, because we're kind of strung along on a carrot. And I don't mean to say that because we're dealing with a large rabbit here, is that like, you know, the idea at first is like, oh, he's like actually imagining these things. He's got like, I mean, he has the famous, it's now pretty heavily memed scene with his therapist when it's like, I made a friend today, real or imaginary? Imaginary. I saw it going around like, I made a friend today, real or on Twitter? But there's that whole element that we're like led to believe that he's imaginary, and then, you know, with the flip gets switched to realize, oh, he's not. Like, he actually has figured this stuff out as well, and he's going back to telling Donnie these things, of course accumulating in the sort of like the climax of the movie, that it's like, oh, they're now in the same place and not in like a weird like overlay of time and space. They're actually there. Right.
And well, it's like it's clever in the ways that they try to portray Frank as being completely part of his imagination, because I mean, as far as the audience knows or understands, I mean, Donnie is an unreliable narrator. He's schizophrenic. He takes medication for it. He's got issues, and it is very like the psychiatrist had to ask him, like, it's a very possible, you know, situation where you would have made up an imaginary friend. Is that what happened? I made up an imaginary friend. And so as an audience, we don't know. I mean, we understand that something is going on that's strange because he saved him from getting crushed, and he's appearing at times where Donnie can see him, but other people can't see him. When he's in the psychiatrist's office, he's talking to her, he can see Frank, and Frank looks at the sky, and he has like sort of this thing, but obviously his psychiatrist can't see Frank. And so the fact that it sort of slowly drip feeds this of, you don't understand what's real and what's not, it's very dreamlike, until sort of the reveal that Frank is somebody who is like friends with his sister, and is an actual guy. And I guess I don't know if we want to get into the ending, but I don't really want to go over those plot beats. If you haven't seen Donnie Darko, you should actually go watch it and enjoy it. I don't want to give away sort of the big climax of the movie, but it's very satisfying in that it sets up some of these things as we don't know what's in Donnie's head or what is a product of, the real world that he's having to deal with. But it meshes these things in such a way that it sort of just keeps you intrigued throughout. And I think when the ending happens, it's not much of a twist. I think it's pretty organic in the way that it comes together. And it's really satisfying. I really enjoyed sort of the way that the movie concludes itself again.
Yep. And it's genuinely heartbreaking. Like a movie that has this sort of like really strong sort of satirical edge to it throughout the movie. It would be very easy for this to be, because you're dealing with a character who is like pretty cynical of the things that are going on. It would be really easy for the movie to end in a way that's cynical. It ends in irony, but it actually ends up in a way that's kind of like emotionally heartbreaking. And of course, it's iconic at this point, the cover of Mad World that underscores those final moments of the movie. It's just like, wow, it's fantastic. It's beautiful. So I was really happy to rewatch this movie. I was, and really like kind of like, I guess I won't like apologize for never like being in like the cult of the movie. It's definitely a movie that has plenty of defenders. It doesn't need any sort of, but like I really understood like the sort of like greatness of the movie this time out, and really like seeing how how Richard Kelley like ties everything together. And I guess I shouldn't have been so naive to the sort of like politicism of this, given his follow-up movie, Salvin Tales, which is like a complete like sprawling political satire of the like Bush administration, Bush era. So it's like, it's very natural and makes sense. It's like, oh, it's here also. I personally like it better when it's like a texture bubbling underneath and a vessel for other things. Whereas like Southland Tales, like that's the crux of the entire movie, but I prefer it here, even though I do think that movie's big and ambitious. But I guess maybe a little backstory for people, like of course it's a huge cult movie. It notoriously tanked when it came out. The biggest reason for its tank, because it played at Sundance in 2001, had like great critical response upon its theatrical release. But it was very limited in its marketing because they already started the marketing before 9/11, and because a jet engine crash is a big crux of this movie, they couldn't really retool or re-edit. They didn't have
I think
money.
it was on the posters, right? I think there was like images of either a plane going down or a part of a plane going down, and it was supposed to come out either into September or October of 2001. And they pretty much pulled all marketing for it. So like going into its release, there was like no images anywhere.
Yeah, I know they recalled that poster, because the poster we see is the one of Frank made out by like everyone's profile photo is the one, but people were like, what's this movie about? And then of course they barely marketed it. Of course it's a small movie. They didn't have the budget of like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man to go and reshoot elements that maybe incorporated like either that or the Twin Towers in it and like shoot it out of the movie. And of course like Drew Barrymore's in this movie, which we never mentioned. She's also the producer of this movie. She took a pay cut.
She's a hero.
For this movie to get made. Richard Kelley was famously writing scripts after college, and this one was sought after, but it took a couple years to get financing because he wanted to direct it, and people didn't want to give a shot to a first-time director in that way. So but I'm happy it happened, because the movie it's great, and I highly recommend. If you haven't seen it, it's widely available. As I showed earlier, Arrow Videos put out this really excellent 4K transfer of it. Definitely go seek it out. Though this is the part in the show, unfortunately, though, to our new listeners, this is where we talk about a movie that you probably shouldn't seek out. And this is why we do the bad in the center as well, because we get to swing back to a movie that, even if it isn't quote unquote good, we at least it's interesting. And I think we're gonna have a lot to say when we get to Lost Highway, for sure. What we don't really have a lot to talk about is 2004's The Butterfly Effect, which is a movie that's oh boy, like if you Google movies like Donnie Darko, did this as an experiment, this is the number 2 movie that shows up in that. And I think for good reason, which is like the only thing with good reason I'll say about the Butterfly Effect, is because this movie cribs a ton of elements from Donnie Darko, more than I remembered. This was a movie I was excited to see when it came out, weirdly enough. And I remember like buying it with like either like chore money, like lawn mowing money. Like I went to go buy the DVD of this because I didn't get a chance to see it in the theater. And even then at like 14, I was so disappointed in this movie. But as an adult, I was infuriated by this movie. I don't want to put the cart before the horse here, but I think like the biggest thing about the Butterfly Effect is, for one, we should do the courtesy that this movie doesn't do and issue a trigger warning to our listeners, because the Butterfly Effect deals with like really dark, disturbing subject matter that it doesn't have the means to do in a delicate way. But yes, trigger warning, the aspects of this movie include, but are not limited to, pedophilia, infanticide, oh God, what else does it deal with? Like,
I mean, drug addiction.
Yes.
I mean, I guess, like, there's a laundry list of like very heavy abuse, like animal torture.
Yes, animal cruelty. Oh God, that seems so horrible.
And like every scenes are horrible. Everything is horrible, like mental illness and just real traumatic shit that like. It's not stuff that I would say doesn't belong in a movie, because I don't think that there's, in the world of movies, in the world of art, I don't think anything is off limits. I think we should be able to explore and really suss out everything from the most surface level of enjoyable things to some really dark corners. I mean, it's humanity. We're exploring it through expression. So nothing should be off limits. But of course, there are certain subjects that, when they are explored, they require some tact. They require you to treat it with a bit of respect in order to not come off as a fucking asshole. And so when you have the screenwriters of some of the Final Destination movies approaching things like child rape, you're going to run into a situation where like you are not going to approach this with any level of subtlety. That is not in your repertoire. So when the movie itself is just a deluge of misery, and it is not being handled with a deft hand or a deft eye, or anybody who seems to really care, it's the point of including it in the movie is to shock you and to assault you and make you feel sick and make you feel awful. So they're like watching a 2-hour movie just full of shit that makes you feel awful, but with no substance there that's going to cause self-reflection or really like grip you and make you think about it. It's just images to upset you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you beat me to it, because that was my big, like, among many things about this movie that are wrong and wrong-headed and misguided, is that that the directors, Eric Bress and J. Mackie Gerber, again, hopefully I'm pronouncing those names correctly, they wrote Final Destination 2, and I think one of them wrote the 4th Final Destination movie. Now, like, your opinion on those movies are may vary. Like, I'm in the minority. I actually don't like the Final Destination movies very much, but even I can admit, like, the Butterfly Effect is basically like a serious Final Destination movie. It is approached with that same tact that those movies are, because those movies are very intentional schlock. Like, they're very like, we know what the audience is here for. We're going to set up like Rube Goldberg-esque like ways in which these characters are going to die, and the audience is going to squeal and they're going to enjoy it. And that's and people do in that way. Like, that is the sort of tact that the Final Destination movies take. When you take that to a movie, that same approach to movies that deal with so many loaded themes as we've discussed, and you apply that same sort of intentional schlock, because this movie is really schlocky at times, like, especially once you get out of the sort of like misery deluge prologue of the movie, which I guess maybe we should just lay out the plot a little bit before we kind of like dive in further. And hopefully we don't spend a lot of time on this movie, because it was,
please God, no,
it was a rough go this time out. I mean, it was a rough go in 2004. It was even worse now, but Essentially, our lead character, Evan, who's played by Ashton Kutcher, has frequent blackouts that are unexplainable, but tend to happen just before an extremely traumatic event in his life. After an adolescence riddled with tragedy and being responsible for manslaughter, which, oh God, that scene is horrible when they go back to it. Like, that's the infanticide I was talking about, which again, like, trigger warning of like the stick of dynamite that blows up a mother and her baby.
Yeah.
Made me sick. I hate this movie so much. Anyway, his mother takes him away from his hometown, and the only person he truly cared for, Kaylee, played by Amy Smart. 13 years later, Evan discovers that when he reads his journal entries, he's able to travel back in time to alter events, potentially creating a better life for himself and Kaylee in the process. However, minor changes have big consequences, and pretty quickly, Evan is risking it all just to go back to a normal life. I mean, that is more or less the movie. It opens with a quote about chaos theory. You know, if you're unfamiliar with the butterfly effect, it's basically that, like, if you go back in time, that even something as small as the flutter of a butterfly's wing can change the course of history. So that's essentially the crux of this movie. And like we said, the prologue of this movie when they're kids is just like one of the most like miserablest experiences, because it's almost like a litmus test, because right out the gate, it's like, all those loaded themes we were talking about are presented like in youth, that like horrible immediately that the horrible like death scene we were talking about, the animal cruelty scene, which is just like horrendous.
It's like, don't kill a dog as it is, like in a movie, like it's not good. Like, it's just there to upset people. So like when you string that out to make it like torturing a dog, why, like, you have to hate your audience to write this movie.
Yes, I feel like this movie has really contempt for the audience. And then even as a kid, it does that thing where I hate in like a bad movie, is where the characters go to the movies and they go and they watch Seven, because of the time and age makes sense. And also it's a New Line Cinema picture. So this theater only plays New Line Cinema movies such as Seven and Dumb and Dumber, despite coming out a year apart from one another. In no way would they be playing at the same time, but I digress. But they go and they're watching Seven, and like, and they actually show a clip. They're in the theater watching Seven. And I'm like, don't show me the movie that I would rather be watching right now. Like, I hate when a bad movie does that, where it's just like, hey, you remember this really great movie? We're sorry. Like, here's what you're about to watch.
Like, not only is it an inappropriate comparison because Seven is great, and this movie is not, and it like evokes that feeling, but like you're sort of like degrading your movie by making that comparison. But like, I feel like the movie is sort of trying to make the comparison in a positive way of like, our movie is dark and edgy and miserable like Seven, because Seven deals with a lot of material that's really rough and like hard to get through, but it's like thematically it makes sense, and it's a satisfying movie, and it's a crime drama, like, so it's supposed to have some of these deeper, darker things. The movie Butterfly Effect basically feels like somebody sat down with a clipboard one day and was just like, list off all of the awful, terrible things that could happen to you in your life, like a terrible event. And they just made a bullet list and shot it in bullet order. And like, that would, like, there was no thought of like, how do we tie these things together thematically? Like, how do we have a through line where there's characters that have arcs and they're learning and growing? Like, because on paper, the idea of I'm going to travel back in time, change something, and then deal with the consequences of it sounds fun. You can definitely do that. I mean, hell, Back to the Future 2 did it by making like the alternate reality with like President Biff or like God Emperor Biff, like whatever he was. So like, you can definitely do it and make it in a fun way to where your characters are like, oh, look at this terrible world. How do we find our way out of this by going back in time and changing it and whatnot? But then like, by making the point of the movie where things just go from the worst thing imaginable to, oh shit, it could have gotten worse and here we are, is like, there's no levity, there's no point in the movie. And like Evan's character, I mean, Ashton Kutcher's doing his best with the material that was handed to him. Everybody in the movie is doing the best of the material that's handed to him. It's just terrible material. He's a non-character. He doesn't really learn or grow or do anything throughout the movie that makes you like care about him. And so then like, you're just watching somebody go through the worst day of their life over and over and over and over. And it's just like, this is so just taxing and tiring and infuriating at
Yes.
every level.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is just a, yeah, like you said, it's a really miserablest experience, and it's supposed to be like, and it's crazy, and I don't want to judge anyone's opinions, you know, definitely like what you like, but I don't know if you've looked, like if you go to IMDb and you go to Rotten Tomatoes, there's a massive gulf between the critical response and the audience response to the movie. People like this movie, like generally speaking, like it was a big hit when it came out, at least on the scale of which it was made. And it's like crazy to me because it doesn't, I think people romanticize the idea of like the time travel and like doomed sort of fate. So like I understand maybe, despite all the subject matter, that it's not delicate enough to handle, why this would connect with people. But to me, like you said, like they bullet pointed, almost like they bullet pointed the worst things they could do, like they could show in a movie. There's that, but it also, like, to tie it back to our previous movie, it almost felt like somebody watched Donnie Darko and like completely missed the point of it. Sure. because it has that sort of like it's such a crummy word, but we'll just say it, like edgy. It has that like same edginess that like Donnie Darko has, but it's superficial. Whereas like, because Donnie Darko, as we said, like really ties in that into its themes and like articulates it really well. I don't really know what the like greater themes of the butterfly effect are, other than just like, okay, watch this person alter the course of history through these sequences of events. And it's like, the only thing I really came away like that I could praise, really, you already mentioned the performances. I do think everyone is doing their best. And I'll go like one step further. When they are finding themselves in different situations throughout time and space, the body language of like every actor like changes to fit that like scenario that they're in, and the makeup is really well done to show like what people like. A lot of thought was put into those details, and I'll give credit to it. But like by the end of it, I'm like, but at what cost? Like at what like purpose was it done for? And I just, it's just, yeah, I know I hate to keep coming back to that word, but it's just a miserable experience. Like, and it's exploitative. Like, and yes. I say this as someone as a huge fan of exploitation cinema, like that has shown like reprehensible crap on the screen, but like this just does it in a way that I feel like is it's tasteless. I don't want to say for tastelessness sake, but it's just done so in a way that, again, I just don't think the filmmakers, I think if you put this in the hands, like say Bress and Gruber wrote this, and you put it in the hands of somebody who could actually be delicate with the material, I think you have a movie here. Like, honestly, I think, and you flesh out the characters a bit more, you flesh out like Evan, so he's not just like a vessel, because that's all he is, really. It's like, I like Donnie, he's an audience surrogate, but not for like we don't see what his worldview is, because we don't see his worldview, at least in the whole prologue, because he blacks out during every single sequence. So they can have it. So like, we don't really know him as a character. And so like, if you flesh that out, you gave it to the hands of a filmmaker who could actually make this, like I said, I think there's something here. But the way it's presented exactly like a Final Destination movie, and I don't want my serious like drama presented in the way in which like a log truck spills out and impales people. Like, just give me that moment, you know?
Right.
Like, don't like misconstrue the two. And so like, and that's the other thing too that also makes this seem super exploitative is it's a plus and a huge minus. It's a huge minus thematically, but like the movie's not stylistically unsound. Like, it's got like a visual style to it. Like, it's a very good looking movie. It's a really, really well produced movie, but it almost makes it worse because it's like so sleek, and you're like, ugh, but like you're really like glazing over all these things, but not at the same time. And it's like, I'm just really uncomfortable watching this movie.
Well, and I'm glad that you made the comparison between Evan and Donnie as characters, both that they are sort of audience surrogates, but that they're surrogates for the writer. And they even going a bit further, they are both there's a messiah complex to both of these movies,
Right.
where the main character is ultimately going to make a sacrifice, and there's a bit more so in The Butterfly Effect than in Donnie Darko, because he ultimately ends up being a deus ex machina for the Gretchen's story in Donnie Darko, and it's a sacrifice that makes sense for his character to want to make, and it's tragic because he was starting to learn something about loving life and understanding life, but then he gives it up because he was in love with this girl. That's less so the case with Evan, who is sort of an empty shell of a character. He's not, we don't really understand his motivations and his loves and his desires and whatnot. He's very surface level, but there's still a messiah complex going on and a persecution complex going on. Like, I feel like there's something trying to be worked out here by whoever wrote it, to the point where, like, his character, I made the mention earlier about an argument that you have with yourself in the shower that you win, but like that's not what happens in real life. That's how every interaction is sort of written in this movie for Evan. So like when he goes back in time to being a kid in the basement when there was like the child porn thing going on that was not handled well at all, his lines of like talking to the father are very much written like a that happened post.
Listen close then, fuckbag. You screw this up again, I'll flat out castrate you. What you need to do is discipline your son Tommy, because the kid is one sadistic pup.
Like, you know, if there would have been an audience there, they would have stood up and clapped for the way that he told off this guy. And it comes so very much like copy pasta that you'd see on a message board. It doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel right. It feels so manufactured.
Yes.
That like, again, like the subject material that you're dealing with here is very serious, but then you're not taking it seriously.
Yes.
So like as an audience member, I'm stuck in this limbo of like, this feels like a cheap creative writing assignment of a high schooler wrote it, but you're dealing with subject material that makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable.
Yes.
I don't like either which way we're going here.
Yes.
Like,
I'm glad you brought back those flashback sequences, or the sequences where he jumps back, reads from his book, and he goes back to that time as a kid, but he's speaking as he's an adult because he's saying like fuck and all these like swear words over and over again. And it's done so in a way, again, that's like comical. And it's like, again, it's unsettling. It's just like bad tone management. It right. Doesn't like what are you supposed to be feeling in this moment? Like, are people supposed to like laugh because it's not that funny, and like you're dealing with like horrendous shit in the movie? And it's just like, and that through line continues, I feel like, even outside of the like flashback scenes where he goes and reads from the book, because it happens even and I'm sure we're going to get to it because it kind of leads into the ending, is like, I want to say it's the second to last scenario when he wakes up as a quadriplegic or a quadruple amputee. And like, that should be a very like, again, like serious, sad moment, but it's treated with such like schlock that like he wakes up, and I think his line is something like, what the shit is this?
What the fuck is this?
Like he says it like he's Michael Kelso from That 70s Show. And it's like, again, he's trying, Ashton Kutcher is, but it's like that specific like line reading, it's just like it's all wrong for what the movie wants to do. It's so strange.
Well, and like that whole segment is really weird to me. I know that the director's cut of the movie goes full blown schlock. But at this point in the movie, like he's changed the past, goes forward. Well, I mean, so like the entire kickoff of the thing, because not only are the screenwriters not handling any of the subject material appropriately, Evan himself doesn't handle it appropriately, because he has a sort of flashback where he like doesn't know that he can do this. He brings a girl home from the bar, and she finds his journals and is like, you should read me a passage. And he jumps to a page and starts reading it, and has a slow realization that what he's reading is one of the moments where he blacked out when he was about to be like put in like through a traumatic experience where he was in like a child pornography movie. He doesn't stop reading it. For some reason, he continues reading the passage to this woman he just brought home from the bar. And then It causes him to black out. He goes back in time, unbeknownst to him at this moment. He thinks he's just reliving it, in his head. But he goes back in time, realizes what's going on, that this thing that he forgot, and then he flashes forward to he's back in the room with that girl. And so he goes and finds Elizabeth Smart in this hometown that he had left there like 13 years ago or whatever, working in a diner. Like, meets her after she gets off shift, does like the pleasantries of like, hey, been a long time, haven't seen you in a while. Anyway, do you remember that one time when we were kids and we were like in a child porn? And it's just like, you're not gonna like take her home and sit down, or like you're just a fucking truck crashing through a wall in this conversation, man. Like, you're blowing the doors off. And it's
she has the right, like, she's the only person in this movie at any moment, in that moment, who has the absolute right response to something like that. She's like, this is my life and what I deal with. You're like, you're going to come back. I haven't seen you for 13 years and you're going to ask about this. Like,
yeah,
fuck you.
You abandoned me. And then you like come crashing into my life and go, hey, you remember that extremely traumatic experience that you had as a kid? You want to like fill me in on the details of what happened then? Like, fuck no, she doesn't, dude.
No, oh my God, it's awful. And like, God bless Amy Smart, man. Like, she gets like really the short end of the stick in terms of material and what her character has to go through, because she literally is just the sort of push for Evan's non-character. Because like, she has certainly, to me, I think more of an arc, but it's so sidestepped. And so it's like, she's put in these situations where it's just like, okay, she's working at the diner and still lives in this hometown. And then, okay, and now she's in a sorority in this situation, but then now she's like a prostitute. And like, I just feel so bad. And I want to at least credit her, because I think she absolutely does her all in every sequence. And she gives more than this movie gives back is basically what I want to say.
She's the, honestly, like, not Evan, she's the sympathetic character in this one, where it's just like, and I mean, God, I hate talking about this movie.
We can get out of it quick.
We'll pivot soon. But I mean, I do want to, I want to get into sort of the crux, I think, that shows the studio came in and wrested away the end of this movie, which is, you watched the director's cut and I watched the theatrical cut. And so then compare and contrast, I don't think there's really much that goes on in the bulk of the movie proper. I think really the director's cut is the ending change.
There's even shots that are the same in the director's cut ending and the theatrical cut ending. So yeah, the director's cut was wrestled away, which was honestly probably explained its financial success, because had the movie ended the way the director's cut ends, this would be a F cinema score, like tank after the first weekend type movie, because it is shockingly tasteless, even for this movie. Like, I was aghast watching the director's cut and how this movie ended. So the theatrical cuts essentially ends with it's after the quadruple amputee scenario. Both movies, it's after the quadruple amputee scenario, and essentially in that scenario, Evan's friends have all like lived a normal life, like Amy Smart's character and her brother, their other friend, like they are now like in good spots, and they're doing well. Evan isn't. The reason Evan decides to change that scenario is because his mom's doing bad, doing poorly. She started chain smoking after Evan became a quadruple amputee and is dying of lung cancer. And so he decides to make that change. He ends up in a mental institution in both cuts. In the theatrical cut, he goes back to a scenario of a birthday party when they were younger, and tells Amy Smart's character as a child that he says like, I fucking hate you, and if you come anywhere near me, I'll kill you. Like, just something horrible like that.
Kids things,
right? Essentially forces her, her and her brother move in with her mom, not their pedophile father. And so they go on and they have a life in they go to college. They're like completely doing great. Evan wakes up in the present. Their other friend is his roommate, his college roommate, instead of Ethan Suplee. And he's like, what about he's like, where's Kaylee? And he's like, who's Kaylee?
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, Evan now has his life. Kaylee and her brother have this life. Kaylee and Evan share a glance. At one point, there's like a little bit of ambiguity of whether or not they're going to recognize one another, and then they proceed about. And so that's how that movie ends. Everyone they don't get to be together, but they get to have their lives separately.
Right.
So that's the movie the audience slashed onto. The director's cut, which again, trigger warning for all the horrible stuff. And I'm not even going to show the worst part when we cut to clips of this, because it is awful. So similarly, he's in the mental hospital. And tell me, in the theatrical cut, because Evan earlier in the movie has dinner with his mom upon finishing or on the cusp of finishing his PhD. He does his mom say that she had 3 stillborn births before him and that he was like her miracle baby? Did that happen in the theatrical cut?
I don't remember that happening in the theatrical cut.
Okay, so that was probably a nugget set for the director's cut only.
Oh, there's a payoff for that. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but payoff's not the word I would use. But so in the director's cut, there's that. They have that exchange, and then they go to a psychic, and the psychic says like he has no soul. And so he needs his mom to get these old 8mm videos, like from their younger 16mm reels. And so he's watching the reel when he's about to be born, and he sees that. He goes back to his self in the womb and strangles himself and then that like audio comes in of like, you have no soul, whatever. And then they, like I said, they use the same clips of Kaylee graduating from high school and like from the theatrical one. So I'm like, I was aghast. Like I said, I could not believe that was the decision that they made. And again, it completely cribs Donnie Darko, for one, because Donnie makes that sacrifice, but it's purposeful. Like this one is just like, this movie's already like misery porn. Like I hate that term, but that's pretty much what it is. And then to put an ending like that is like the most like biggest fuck you that this movie could continue to do. It is I could not believe what I witnessed.
Well, and it's the ultimate like edginess, because it's like an angsty 13-year-old kid that's like, oh, the world would be better if I was never born. This is a 2-hour movie of explaining that like shitty attitude of like, oh, I made the ultimate sacrifice of like making sure I was never born, and then everybody else in my life was happier because I was never born. And it's like he doesn't learn any grand lesson about himself or the world around him, or how to be a better person, or just treat better like people with more respect. He has a time travel ability. Like he could just go back and like make less shitty decisions. It could be like a Groundhog Day scenario of like making a series of decisions until you find the right one. And so like there's definitely an ability here for him to do that, but that's not what the movie is trying to accomplish. The movie is trying to justify suicide ultimately, in the director's cut at least. And it's like, it's fucked up. Especially with like all the other themes that the movie is tackling, that the ultimate solution to all of the terrible shit that you've just slogged through for 2 hours is to watch a fetus kill itself. It's just like, I can't fucking understand how this got, like, somebody read this and funded this movie.
I can't even believe that they decided to even release that as a director's cut. Like, I would have swept that under the rug and be like, no, we're not gonna show it.
It's embarrassing.
It's
fucked up.
Exactly. It's like I don't know why this came to mind. It's like the original ending of Mac and Me came to mind, where the kid gets like blown away. And I'm like, that's because like they never put that in any release, even like the Blu-ray release. They're like, we're gonna sweep it under the rug. I probably would have done the same with this ending, because it's just like awful.
Shouldn't have stopped with the ending. Should have swept the whole movie under the rug.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fair point. So, and that's probably a good exclamation point to put at the end of this one. And I think we should move on to a movie that's much more interesting to talk about. So Lost Highway from 1997. Again, if you are new to our show, welcome. We're so happy to have you. Again, we're so grateful to be here at the North Bend Film Festival. The what category is a bit of a catch-all. We've talked about different types of like what makes a what. In the past, we've talked about movies that are like have like great ideas, great like nugget of an idea that they didn't quite come to fruition. We've talked about things like Tron Legacy and Radioactive Dreams in that realm. We've talked about like complete and utter batshit insanity that you have to see to believe. Such movies such as Lawnmower Man, Night Killer, Savage Harbor. So Lost Highway, this is a bit of a different what that we've encountered. And admittedly, we put it together and we were looking up movies that fit with Donnie Darko and the Butterfly Effect. We came up with this one. I kind of took a bit of a gamble, I'm not going to lie, and I want to kick it to you to hear your thoughts, because this was a first time watch for you. I won't bury the lead. This is a top 3 David Lynch movie for me, depending on what day you ask me. It's Mulholland Drive, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and this or Blue Velvet, again, depending on the week. I adore this movie. But I know it is one of Lynch's most polarizing movies, and I know you've been a bit hot and cold on the David Lynch movies that you have seen. So I will kick it to you. I kind of gambled a little bit because I didn't know how you were going to feel about this movie. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
I think my feelings on this movie pretty much sum up my feelings on David Lynch himself. I have not seen all of David Lynch's stuff. I have not watched Twin Peaks, so I've not watched Fire Walk with Me because I feel like I need the context of the show for that.
Yeah.
But I would say of the David Lynch movies that I've watched, this, Blue Velvet, Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive, I've enjoyed all of them largely. But upon finishing them, I have like, cool, I enjoyed that. It was a good thing. How do I explain this? How do I even digest it, or how do I feel about it? Because it's very, Lynch's work is all very much dreamlike and trying to evoke a mood or a sense or a feeling. It's not so much a narrative through line. We're not so much trying to construct a believable world that you can be immersed in. It's very much like we're trying to make you feel uncomfortable, or we're trying to make you feel nervous, and we'll play with themes in order to evoke emotions. And so like it's very expressionist, it's very out there and strange. So I enjoyed Lost Highway, but I remember finishing it and being like, how can I tie this into Donnie Darko, or I mean even worse, the Butterfly Effect, because they are in some ways very diametrically opposed. But then when we're talking about themes of sacrifice in the world around you and understanding love and humanity, all of those themes are still in there, but presented in a very David Lynch way.
Yes. And I think that's the other thing too, to know for sure, because Donnie Darko and Butterfly Effect almost have a one-to-one, because you have a character who can directly do this sort of like time travel, different ways, and both involve a book. Like there's almost like identical ways to do it. Lost Highway doesn't. There is, and it's not even necessarily time travel. A little bit. It's almost like parallel universe travel, overlapping, the world folding in on itself sort of deal. And so I guess to get into it, I can start kind of explaining the plot as much as I can. The plot is like, it's really just a vessel for like Lynch's expressionist feelings. And I also feel like to a certain extent, this is like as much as I adore this movie, this is kind of like the Mulholland Drive trial run, because it has a sort of dream logic. And then when it makes the flip that we're going to talk about, like there's like elements from the other one that overlaps. Mulholland Drive, of course, like has these, because it's largely a dream, and then Mulholland Drive takes that flip and you're like, oh, okay, all those things that are happening in actuality get like muddled and like cross-wired into this dream scenario. Lost Highway, it's never clear, and I'm fine with it. But like that, it's never clear if it's like a dream or an alternate universe. It's time travel. It's just sort of like it's chaos, really. Like this movie is chaos. But I do adore it, and we'll start with kind of like explaining it. So there's the character of Fred, played by Bill Pullman. He's a jazz saxophonist. In a typical, there's his like musical number. I think typically Angelo Badalamenti scored it, as he scored every David Lynch film. Nightclubs, very much a part of David Lynch's movies. So very, very his introduction sort of is very Lynchian in that way. He is finding that his wife Renee, played by Patricia Arquette, is distant. He suspects that she might be unfaithful. He's starting to get like very protective, especially they go to a party later that's helmed by or put on by a porn director. So he's starting to draw suspicions of like, well, how do you know this guy? Like what like things have led to that. But they are starting to get weird cryptic signals. Like they starting to get videotapes sent to them that were filmed in their own house. They're getting like messages ring to their doorbell. Dick Laurent is dead, which is like the first one that comes into play. Of course, probably the most important one. Things start to really like progress, and in a sort of haze after this party sequence, Fred runs into this mysterious man played by Robert Blake, scarily prophetic there, and who tells him that, like, you know, call your house, I'm in your house right now as we speak. After this encounter, much like Evan in The Butterfly Effect, Fred blacks out, and next thing he knows, he's in a police interrogation room, being pummeled because his wife is found dead. So he gets sentenced to death. He's on death row. And then all of a sudden wakes up one day, and it's not him in that prison cell anymore. It's this young Pete Dayton, played by Balthazar Getty, who's sitting there, who's got a little bit of a rep sheet of his own, but nothing like not murder in the first degree. So they let him go. And in typical David Lynch fashion, there's you know, the like detectives or cop figures that are like portrayed for largely dark comedic effect. They have some of the best lines in the movie, or at least one of the best lines in the movie.
Fucker gets more pussy than a toilet seat.
And so Pete then he works at a mechanic's office, and he is in with this Mr. Eddie, this like seemingly powerful gangster, played by Robert Loggia, and what is easily the standout performance of this movie. We'll get into that. But he is smitten with a woman that Mr. Eddie is seeing named Alice, who's also played by Patricia Arquette. And then at this point it becomes like it goes from like Lynchian dream logic, Lynchian underscored, like sound is such an important thing in Lynch's movies. It has that low like hum, like dark hum throughout, like the opening with Bill Pullman's character and that whole sequence. But when it takes this shift, it pretty much kind of becomes like a conventional neo-noir, or not conventional. Conventional is not a word I would use to describe it, but it becomes a very but it becomes more of a neo-noir. Like you have the femme fatale, that she's got her own sort of motivations for what she's doing, and she finds Pete. She knows Pete is smitten with her and is using that and using her means to get what she wants. And then really once that happens, all the wires get crossed, time and space and the continuum doesn't even matter, and it all starts to fold in on itself. So it's and I guess maybe that's where, I mean, God, where do we start? There's a lot to unpack with this movie.
I was curious to hear your synopsis to remind myself of what I just watched, because it's even weirder than that makes it sound. And in very Lynchian fashion, the scenes have a lot of characters just sort of standing together and not really expressing their thoughts and their feelings or anything in the situation, but like you were saying, like there's just a droning sound, just the way that they're looking at each other and their posture. It sort of like informs you of their relationship to one another, because very like early on between Patricia Arquette and Bill Pullman's character, when they're just in the apartment together, spatially they're very far apart. They don't stand and face each other. They're always sort of looking in different directions, and their conversations are very cold, very hurt. He seems to have almost an underlying rage that's there. Like you can sense that there's something there where he is very upset with her, but like we haven't quite been filled in on it yet. And all of this is coming across very much through the language of cinema. Where they're not sitting down and having a conversation. You're gathering all this by just how it's framed and like the sound design and the lighting. And so there's a lot to love here, just from the standpoint of a filmmaker who is honing his craft. Like you said, I think Mulholland Drive probably does this a bit better in some regards. But there's a lot to love there just from the simple craft of it. And the performances of the characters, they're not given a lot in terms of dialogue and stuff, but there's a lot for them to chew on. And I think everybody in this movie is excellent.
everyone is fantastic. I mean, especially Patricia Arquette, given that she is in a dual role and she plays those characters with such different approaches each time. And I think like she's absolutely fantastic. But everyone from top to bottom, small or big role, I think is like fantastic in the movie. I like a couple standouts I would point to are Pete's parents, played by Gary Busey and Lucy Butler, who are just awesome. Like they're just like these old like biker like family, and they're like super understanding of Pete. Like they're really sweet. Like and like I love their performances in the movie. He's only in a scene or two, but Richard Pryor, one of his best dramatic roles outside of Blue Collar. Probably a little bit of a nod here to Paul Schrader's Blue Collar, because that's set in a mechanic or a car plant in Detroit, and so he's a mechanic here. So I feel like there's a little bit of a hat tip to that. You know, of course, Robert Loggia, which like this, you know, you said like, you know, this has all the Lynchian hallmarks. Like it has his soundscape, it has the a terrific Angelo Badalamenti score, it has absurdist comedy, you know, none more exemplified by Robert Loggia's infamous rant about tailgating.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So good.
Don't you ever fucking tailgate! Ever!
Tell him you won't tailgate.
Ever!
I won't ever.
Do you know how many fucking car lengths it takes to stop a car at 35 miles an hour? 6 fucking car lengths! That's 106 fucking feet, mister! If I had to stop suddenly, you would have hit me! I want you to get a fucking driver's manual! I want you to study that motherfucker! And I want you to obey the goddamn rules! 50 fucking thousand people were killed on the highway last year because of fucking assholes like you! Tell me you're gonna get a manual!
Get a manual.
Fucking A! Oh, God!
Apparently, Robert Loggia, Lynch, and I should also note he co-wrote this movie with Barry Gifford, who wrote the novel Wild at Heart, which Lynch ultimately made. And so they liked working together on that, and so they collaborated on this original project. I love Wild at Heart, but I think I actually prefer this movie. But I'll of course get into like some of the more polarizing aspects to Lynch's already sort of polarizing oeuvre. But apparently Robert Loggia auditioned for the role of Frank Booth that Dennis Hopper played in Blue Velvet, and nobody told him he was auditioning, and Hopper was already cast. And so Robert Loggia got there, realized that he had no shot at getting the part, and he just ripped in to like Lynch and the casting director, went on a huge like profanity laced tirade. And that always stuck with David Lynch. So when he was writing the role of Mr. Eddie, he was like, Robert Loggia is going to play this part. My best David Lynch impersonation. But he's fantastic in the movie as well. Even like little things like Henry Rollins plays one of the security guards, who's great. Like they have that like exchange of like, because it's also like a slow burn in the start. Like this movie just doesn't explode into like that weirdness, because Bill Pullman's character is like experiencing headaches and nosebleeds, and before this like there's a lot of like body horror in this movie too, like actual like transition into Balthazar Getty's character. But one of the prison guards comes back, he's like, man, that wife killer is starting to look really fucked up. And he's like, which one?
And they just share like a
dark laugh,
like laughing about it.
Exactly.
This gallows humor of a couple of guards on death row, which feels appropriate.
There's a lot of gallows humor in this movie too, and I think that's where this comes into play as far as Lynch's most polarizing film, because I think it's the movie that has the least amount of like redemption and the least amount of like emotional core. Because like, even though his movies of course are surrealist and they're drawing on dream logic and they are, you know, not like meant to be followed, you know, again, these are not meant for Reddit boards to figure out, like you're just kind of supposed to roll with it. They more or less have like an emotional or at least like a thematic core. You know, of course Blue Velvet very much, I mean, I would actually, to take it back, I think Donnie Darko is probably indebted a lot to Blue Velvet, of like the sort of like dark underbelly of an idyllic town sort of thing. So like Blue Velvet has that aspect, and then there's of course the romance between Kyle MacLachlan and Laura Dern in that movie, and then of course you feel for Isabella Rossellini in that movie. Similarly with Wild at Heart, like it's a dark, violent journey, but the relationship between Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern is like really sound. Mulholland Drive has like a clear through line when it makes that switch. Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, like Laura Palmer's Fate, is arguably Lynch's most emotional, like purely emotional scenes in the movie.
I love you, James!
But like Lost Highway, again, has all its hallmarks, but it is so dark and there is no redemption in the movie, whatever, because Lynch is a romantic, I think, at heart. Like there's a lot of romanticism in his movies, and I don't think there's any of that here. I don't think any line exemplifies that further than, and I know we're jumping around a lot, but that's just the nature of this movie.
So is Lynch, so it's fine.
Exactly. when Balthazar Getty's character, when Pete and Alice have sex out into that like desert where the like the burning shack is. That's the other thing. Like Bill Pullman and Balthazar Getty keep seeing this image of this burning shack in the middle of the desert, and so they're having sex in the headlight of the car, and just like that soundscape. She's like, I want you, and then she gets up and she goes,
You'll never.
And it's like, oh, okay. All that romanticism is out the window.
Yep.
Like it is so dark and dreary. And so, like I said, I think it's at least, it's still humane, but I think this is definitely, like I said, I think it's his darkest movie just from the standpoint of like, there are no redemption for these characters. They literally are on like a figure-8 highway, essentially. They are just going in circles and there is no way out.
Right. Well, and I think like there's a lot of themes going on with like corruptibility and I mean, of course, duality, because there's sort of like this doppelganger element that's going on,
which is another Lynchian hallmark for sure.
Yeah, he loves to play with that. But I there's several times in the movie where like the mood is so strong that it was affecting I mean, just the point of them getting the videotapes and watching the videotapes together, and of course somebody's like watching their house, but the section where whoever's controlling the videotape goes into their house, walks down their hallway and shows them like sleeping in their bed, is like so disturbing on so many levels. Like what a terrifying image of like the ultimate act of voyeurism of somebody coming into your home while you are at your most vulnerable and just videotaping you, and like you're completely unaware of it. Like the idea of it is so fucking scary that it hangs like this looming dread over, I mean, at least the rest of the scenes with Bill Pullman, is that like there's just this sort of almost omnipresent threat of like, who is this person? How did they get access to the house? Why are they doing this? And like you said, when he meets the guy at the party who's like, I'm in your house right now while we are talking and you can call. And he does call him on a phone, and the guy is in his house and he's having a conversation with him where they're able to answer each other.
Give my phone back to me.
yeah, exactly. And he like asks a question. He like asks him a question and he's like, ask the other me. And so then he has to say it into the phone to ask the other guy. So like, this dream logic sort of stretches it out like further, where it's already nightmarish, but now it's taking on an even more like literal nightmare quality of there's something supernatural going on here. How much of this is real? How much of this is imagined?
Yes.
And so, I mean, it all sort of culminates in this, the slaying of his wife, that again, he blacks out and he doesn't remember any of it. And so the movie sort of like takes you on this sort of journey of introducing this character and putting in this nightmare scenario situation, having the murder happen. You don't know like what is going on really, but like you're sort of getting settled into this one mood. And then the sort of flip that just happens, and it sort of pulls the rug out from under you in a number of different ways. But I love sort of the guard is going through and doing his count of the cells and opens the door, and he has a reaction of like, oh, like Jesus Christ, like, oh my God, like something like that, and runs away. And like, I sort of thought like he had killed himself, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's what was trying to be implied, but
Yes.
like they don't show in the cell. He just like has this reaction, and you're just like, oh, like he killed himself. They show him looking up at the bars and across the roof of the cell, and of course, I thought Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh yeah.
When the kid gets
Rod,
hanged by the bars,
yeah.
So that's immediately what I thought of, and then just the reveal of like, no, he didn't kill himself. He body swapped with a completely different person, and we have no idea why or what happened to Bill Pullman's character.
And we still don't
just like,
and the other thing, even further, what I love about the movie is like, because we don't see that happen in full, we just see like little snippets and flash cutaways to it, just as we did for that. And similarly, Pete's parents saw that happen to him, because he keeps asking what happened that night, and they're like, it was horrible, like the most horrible thing we've ever witnessed. We don't even want to talk about it, sort of thing. So it's like we never really get a sense. All we know is that like it happened, and it's like weird like body snatchers, or maybe even more like the Fly, like deterioration like situation. We don't see it, and it's actually all the better for it. And we also don't know, because Bill Pullman does come back into play in this final like leg of the movie, but we don't even know what happens to his character in the interim when we're following Pete's journey, which is also interesting. All we know is like the wires are getting crossed somewhere along the line, because there's a scene where Pete's driving in a car and he's listening to the radio, and his Bill Pullman's saxophone number that is playing in the car. Similarly, when they go to the porn maker, to Andy, played by Michael Massey, when they go him and Alice have this sort of like plan to rob his money and get away. And that's the other thing too. It's like this movie's already ambiguous to the nature of what's happening to the characters, and then you throw in an unreliable narrator, because Alice is telling Pete all these things, but you don't necessarily, by the end, you don't know what she said, whether it's true or not. Like the scenario she says of like, oh, this is how I got in with Mr. Eddie, when they make her do like that strip number. Like, yes, we see that as an audience, but it's like, did that actually happen? Like, are you just feeding this story to Pete to get him to do what you want him to do? So you already throw that in, so it makes it like more messy. But they go to the porn director's house, which is like the most gnarly death sequence in the movie. I've never looked at a glass table the same way again, like since I've seen this movie. Like I think of that scene in Game Night when the glass tables aren't breaking, and they're like, oh, glass tables are acting weird tonight, and that's like, now it's like I got crosswired here, because like, no, they don't break, you just slice your fucking head in the center of it. But he goes and he finds a picture, and then there's a picture that's got him, and it's got Robert Loggia, and it's got both Patricia Arquettes in the picture. And he's like, and so it's like that at the point he's starting to have headaches and nosebleeds, just like Bill Pullman did. So it's like his sort of fabric of reality is starting to unravel in that moment. And as he's like, wavering, we find out there's a Lost Highway hotel, and his like memories are getting intertwined, because we think that's at the porn director's house, but then we find out this is actually in the middle of God knows where.
Right. Well, and because like, and they're playing with like spatially with some weird games, because when he's at the porn star's, I'm saying it too, the porn director's house, after they've killed him, he's starting to get a headache and a nosebleed, and he's like, "What? Like, where's the bathroom?" And she says, "Oh, it's upstairs to the left." And he goes upstairs, and then he's in the hallway of the Lost Highway hotel. And like going up and down, and like he opens like one of the room doors, and Patricia Arquette's character is in there having sex with somebody. I don't remember right now, but it's sort of like this nightmare sequence that's splashed with red light. And she's basically like haunting him or teasing him.
It's Robert Loggia, isn't it?
Is it Robert Loggia?
Yeah, because
there is a scene with Robert Loggia.
Yeah, because when he reverses back to Bill Pullman, he goes to that same hotel, and Robert Loggia, who turns out is Dick Laurent in Bill Pullman's reality, is having sex with Renee, which is the Patricia Arquette in his reality.
Right.
So I think that's what Pete is seeing, because his is starting to get intertwined with Bill Pullman's, and it's just like, it's just insane. And another thing we should note in these sequences as well, I mean, it's great throughout. This is one of those movies where, like, if you haven't seen it, it's one of those movies where the soundtrack was bigger than the movie itself. Most notably, Nine Inch Nails' The Perfect Drug was written for this movie, but there's also great like soundtrack with Smashing Pumpkins, David Bowie, Lou Reed, Marilyn Manson, who Marilyn Manson and Twiggy Ramirez make a brief cameo in one of the porno movies shown. But there's 2 Rammstein tracks, and they slap when they get into that like hazy moment. It's like
Rammstein.
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
Last time I saw this movie prior to this rewatch, I feel very fortunate. Last time I saw this was on 35 millimeter at the SIFF Egyptian during a David Lynch retrospective.
Awesome.
Bar none, one of the most gorgeous prints I've ever seen. Like, it was phenomenal. And so when that stereo kicks in, it's just like, yeah, it was great. It was great.
I bet. Yeah. And I mean, like, again, like the craft of the movie, like it all looks great. It all sounds great. And it plays to, I think, the story itself is not straightforward. So I wouldn't want to see this type of movie. And I don't think this type of movie could be really made by somebody other than Lynch. Like, it's very much got all of his hallmarks. And it's such a strange movie because it's so tenuously walking this line that somebody else who doesn't understand this material, it would completely fall apart and be like unwatchable. You wouldn't be able to follow anything that's going on. And the fact that you can come out of this movie being like, again, not able to really tie things together, not being able to explain things, but still find the movie enjoyable, I think is just a testament to Lynch and his craft.
Absolutely. He definitely has that sort of element where he, like, because he often goes off the rails because that's just not him as an artist. Like, he doesn't view, I mean, he started as a painter and he views his films just like abstract paintings, where it's like the imagination is boundless, and I'm not going to be constructed by like a traditional narrative. You can come with me or you can not.
Right.
And so it's definitely, your mileage may vary. And like I said, even as he works in the abstract, he usually has a solid emotional core. And I don't think this movie has that. And so I think maybe that might have been like the crux of the what, in addition to it being really impenetrable in that David Lynch way, is that it is as entertaining as it is, as great as the soundtrack is, as great as all the technical elements, great as the performances is, this movie is bleak by the end of it. And so it really is, like you said, even amongst people such as myself who are massive David Lynch fans, are torn over this one. And I don't feel it even has had that. I mean, it's beloved by a fair amount of people, but I feel like this hasn't even gotten that sort of critical like reassessment the way that something like Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me has, or the way that I think even Wild at Heart has had that to a certain extent. I mean, Wild at Heart won the Palme d'Or at Cannes back in 1990, so it's like it already had some sort of like going into it. But I feel like Lost Highway is still a little bit, as far as like David Lynch-y movies, like, so if you're excluding Dune and The Short Story, like, as far as his movies, I'd say this is still maybe kind of the bastard stepchild. But I think it's great. But yeah. I understand if anyone isn't into it. But I'm really glad you liked it. And so I think this makes it a unique choice in our what, because we were more or less both like incredibly positive on the movie. But I do, I wanted to talk about the David Lynch movie that I feel like doesn't get quite as much love, and also it fits well enough with the other 2 movies we discussed, because there's a lot of shape shifting and time shifting and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, well,
and the same with like Donnie Darko, its time travel element is pretty ambiguous. You don't know exactly if time travel is actually what's happening or if it's just a dream state. But then I think with the other 2, not so much with Bill Pullman's character, but with Pete, played by Balthazar Getty. His character is like a younger guy who's more or less sort of an innocent, who gets then introduced halfway through the movie, and he's slowly corrupted by Patricia Arquette's character, and he's sort of going through the same throes of like learning about himself, learning about the world, trying to understand what love is, and like he's sort of torn between 2 different worlds where like he has a girlfriend and they have sex, and of he falls in love with Patricia Arquette's character, who's more or less using him for her own gains, her own immoral machinations that she has in place. And so there's a bit going on. I mean, of course, it's not a one-to-one scenario, but I think that's why it's a what in this sense. It's not trying to be anything like that. It's very much taking a lot of themes and moods that are identifiable from more Donnie Darko than from Butterfly Effect, I think, but just taking those and using those as its paint instead of trying to construct a narrative in that same world. And so, I mean, it's, again, with Lynch, even if you're not along for the ride, it's at least extremely interesting.
Absolutely. And it's quite a ride it is. And honestly, Chris, I don't think I could pretty put the nail on the head on these movies as well as you did right there. So I think that might be a good spot to start to wind this episode down. As we discussed, I guess with Donnie Darko is readily available pretty much everywhere. Like I said, there's a great new 4K restoration out, but it is available across pretty much every digital platform. Same with both the Butterfly Effect. If you want to check it out, we don't recommend it, but it is available widely, and Lost Highway as well. There's a Blu-ray out by Kino Lorber, and then it's also available to rent on most digital platforms as well. But this is about the time we sign out. Thank you so much, Chris, as always. And we have to thank the North Bend Film Festival. Thank you so much for having us out. This was really a great time. In the meantime, if you are new to our show, you can find all episodes of this show on our website at thegoodbadwhat.com. And you can subscribe to us on pretty much every podcatcher of choice, be it Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Anchor.fm, Google Podcasts. We're on there. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at thegoodbadwhat, or you could email us at thegoodthebadthewhat@gmail.com. And our theme music comes from Paco, and our logo comes from Michelle Parkos. And Chris, where can more people follow you individually online if they so choose?
If you so choose, you can find me on Twitter at THOChristo89 or on Letterboxd at C_THOM.
And you can follow me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Ryollie90. That's RYOLLIE 90. Thank you again. Thank you again to the North Bend Film Festival for having us. And for anyone who's watching, we'll catch you on the next episode. Have a great time at the festival.